Hello, class. I finished reading your discussion posts applying Aristotle to Anne Carson/Euripides Bacchae. So this is going to just be a short response video to kind of the collective discussions of everybody. In general, people were on the right track. Phoebe, who posted first, did a really, really great job. So if you weren't able to look at Phoebe's post, she was very, very thorough. And that's definitely the kind of thing that I'm looking for in terms of discussion posts, beyond just the requirement for like 500 words. So if you didn't read her post, definitely go back and check it out. And Phoebe, great job on that. Jesse, who posted at the end, asked this question, and I think it's a really good question, what Jesse asked, which is, what makes a story complex? And that was one of Aristotle's criteria for a tragedy. And this ties into something that I was noticing across a lot of people's posts, like in various different ways. So, as Tati noted in a post, just sort of reading other people's posts gives us a different perspective on our own reading. And this is a really important thing, I think, about literature classes. It's why I loved being a literature major in school, actually, because I read a lot and I've always loved reading, but there's just nothing that takes the place of like being in conversation with other people who notice different things in a book than I do. And so I find it so enlightening and just like educational to hear other people's perspectives, not even just like the professor's perspective, right? I mean, you get that, like, and I lecture, like I give you long lecture videos, but hearing other people's perspectives and seeing how they put things together and they're trying to make sense of things, I think is really enlightening when we read any kind of text. And one thing that I saw a lot of people, but not everybody did this, but a lot of people in their wrestling with Aristotle's terms, they were wanting to read one particular character as like a protagonist, right? And that wasn't even a term that I used, but that's a term that you guys have picked up, from, I don't know, elementary school, middle school, or high school. And it is a Greek term, right? The protagonist, right? And an agonist, like if you're in a battle, like in a boxing ring or like wrestling, you're in an agonistic relationship, right? That's that relationship of conflict. And so there's the protagonist and the antagonist, the one that go that one and the other. And so we're so used to thinking of this term protagonist as being just kind of one character, the so-called hero, for example. And I think that what you guys, some of you guys kind of struggled with this in really beautiful ways, was, I mean, in a way, like you could read the play as being like Dionysus is the protagonist. In another way, perhaps Pentheus is the protagonist. And people sometimes try to align all of Aristotle's terms with one particular character. And I think that the reason why we do that is because in Aristotle's own book, The Poetics, which we didn't read, he applies all of his terms to the character Oedipus. And he sees everything going on and constellating within Oedipus. Now, I think that Aristotle has, like, there's a richness to what Aristotle describes as the poetics of tragedy. But what Euripides seems to be doing in a much more radical way than Sophocles did in his telling of Oedipus is he distributes out these features. It's not like, I mean, it's not like they're sitting around, by the way, as writers, and they have like this criteria in front of them, like, got to have the agnoresis or anagnoresis. I got to have the peripeteia. I got to throw in I got to make sure the mythos is complete and complex. All of that stuff is described by Aristotle afterwards. But Aristotle is right that these do seem to be features of these tragedies. What I think Euripides has done that's so different and that I think is complex, to answer Jesse's question, is that it's not distributed among one character, right? Some of you mentioned this, a couple of you sort of, I think, rightly drew on the fact that Pentheus is the sacrifice in the play. He does have this kind of doubling association with the bull, and I go through that in my lectures, but he is sacrificed. And we're not always necessarily used to seeing the protagonist as dying or being sacrificed. Usually, like, a protagonist wins out in some sort of way, but instead we see Pentheus being torn to pieces and by his own mother. And then his own mother is the one who comes to this kind of recognition of what she has done. A lot of you were questioning, what is the relationship of Cadmos here, who is his grandfather, right? Pentheus's grandfather. And he seems to be reverent. He's going out with Tiresias, and he's trying to embrace Dionysus, but it doesn't work, right? Like, for all of his efforts, it doesn't work. And so we see something that I mentioned at the end of my lecture video for the week, which is the way that divine, recompense, like, I don't know if I want to call it even divine justice, because it's pretty awful what happens to people, right? But divine reckoning, something like that, is meted out transgenerationally in Greek plays. And so Cadmos, in a way, as being a founder of Thebes, is still implicated in the wrongdoings of his grandson, as is Agave, his mother. So that's really interesting. And so I think one way to think about this is like kind of resisting the tendency to identify just with one character as the so-called protagonist, which I think there are plenty of instances, novels, literature, movies, whatever, where we can identify that, and it seems to be centered on one person. But I think that part of the genius of Euripides, I think, is to not focus it on one person, and that kind of leaves us in a different kind of space as people who are interpreting the play, to balance out what is the relationship between Dionysus and Pentheus. They are cousins. Are they somehow doubles of each other? I don't want to quite go into a psychoanalytic or psychologistic read of things and just saying that these are just two aspects of the same self, but I do think that there is a kind of balancing symmetry going on there. And so I felt like some of you guys were struggling to figure out where the balance was. Trying to remember who said, like, I'm still trying to get your names a little bit, but somebody early on, one of the earlier first 2 or 3 posts, mentioned this way of reading religion into the play, and that there's like a secular space, the sort of secular kingly space, and that the city was sort of operating as a secular space, but Dionysus was resisting that. And so you saw it in this kind of connection between secular and non-secular. And I think, first of all, I think that's a really great question to think about with this play. I also think that that's a very, very contemporary question. So remember, not just because my second PhD is in religious studies, but because my own scholarly interests are in this notion of something I'll unpack throughout the course, not in a big way, it's just an intro course, but my own scholarship is interested in this notion of this called political theology, which is a kind of niche area discussion. And It's been mostly a discussion in philosophy and religious studies, but I've been sort of carving a path for it in literary studies. That's what my own life's kind of research and work is about. And so that, in terms of a contemporary question, whether or not we really are as secular as maybe our liberal culture wants to put it, has been very much questioned philosophically. And this question has nothing to do with like we should be religious or not religious. It's just a question of that the kind of public narratives that we tell about things, and whether or not those public narratives are accurate. So it's not about, I'm really not concerned whether or not people believe or don't believe in any kind of religious thing, but I do think that some kind of literacy around that. If you believe, for example, if you're a committed secularist and you believe that everybody who believes in a religion is somehow backwards or dogmatic, actually you end up being the biased person in our society. And you might have that as a value, secularism as a value. I think a lot of us have that in the United States, especially notions of freedom of religion, all of that deeply embedded in American culture. But to automatically write people off who are believers in whatever they believe as being somehow just stupid or not, like anti-intellectual or incapable of like sort of like rational thought. And this happens unfortunately around race. It gets combined with racism, especially with brown people and especially with Muslims and people who are followers of Islam. That's happened in our culture a lot in the past 20, like post 9/11, this idea of the kind of fanatic, the fundamentalist, right? And the German word for it is Schwarmerei. There's like a long, centuries long discussion around people who are kind of like so passionate about their religious beliefs that they are incited to public action. So I think it's a contemporary question that's really important: secular space versus non-secular or religious, however you want to put it, and then also whether or not we want to see cities in particular as being secular spaces. What's at stake in conceiving of a space that way. Okay, and then the last thing, I'm just going to quit here because I know I gave you guys a long lecture video this week. Are questions. Please remember to ask each other discussion questions at the end of your initial posts. Make them not yes or no questions. And notice how many of you guys had a tendency to say like, hey, I really enjoyed your post. Like so many people's responses to other people started that way. And sometimes it was because people hadn't asked a question, but like let's try and push our interactions with each other to be more human than that, more than just treating each other as commodities, like, oh, I enjoyed this or I disliked this, I agreed with this or I disagreed. Can we like raise our level of discussion in our discussion posts to a kind of really interactive intellectual conversation? That's what I'm interested in, way more than like right or wrong interpretations of texts, is us exercising and really kind of taking in each other's different perspectives, and allowing those perspectives to seep into ourselves. So not even just my perspective, although you have another discussion post that's just a reaction to my lecture video that's due this Saturday. And unfortunately, one of the reasons why I've had to do that is because in different online classes in the past, I can see how many people watch and view the lecture videos, and a lot of students weren't taking the time to watch the lecture videos, and then they were confused about things. They were misinformed or underinformed because they hadn't taken the time to listen to it. And then they would also sort of like come back with questions that had already been addressed later on in the semester in lecture videos. And so under the circumstances of COVID and us being in these online classrooms, whether we like it or not, it is important for you to spend the time in class. And so that's why I ask you guys to respond to the lecture videos and make sure that you at least watch them and understand them to a certain extent. And if you have questions, of course, always ask me about them. Okay, so remember not to make your questions superficial and not to make your interactions with each other superficial. Push for those 200 words. Like make yourself articulate things. Remember that like no words, like it's so easy to not have presence, even if you've engaged and watched or read other people's posts. Like unless you put stuff back out into the online forum, it's really hard to see, for other people to see how engaged you are. Okay, I'm going to end the video there. Just a kind of brief discussion video. Carry on, finish watching my lecture video, post on that by Saturday night. I'm going to start posting videos for Macbeth. I'm reading Macbeth with you guys, so if you're having trouble understanding the language of Macbeth, you might want to watch my videos along with it as you are reading the play, and it will help. I'm making them to help people understand the play a little bit better, which I didn't feel like I needed to do with Bacchae because Anne Carson's contemporary translation. But for Shakespeare, I realize it's an intro class and people might be struggling with the language. So if you are, watch the lecture videos. I'm breaking them down, and I'm walking through the whole text from Act 1 to Act 5. So I've done Act 1 already. I haven't posted it yet, but I will in the next day or two. And then make sure to read and try to understand the text before you try to watch the video, because that's a different thing when you're watching a director's interpretation of the film / play. Okay, have a great weekend, and I'll chime in with you guys with those Macbeth lectures over the next few days and into next week. Thanks very much for your posts. Please email me if you have questions. Take care.